Hello all, welcome to the second installment of a comprehensive multi-part series about the disappearance of Ben McDaniel. With each new deepening layer of research for this case, uncovered and contradictory evidence lends plausibility of several theories about what happened to the lost scuba diver. The most popular and plausible theories. Ben accidentally drowned while exploring the furthest reaches of the cave, and his body is wedged in some crevice or buried in sand, where it remains hidden. Ben committed suicide by purposefully squeezing into a tight space that search divers cannot go, knowing he would not be able to get back out. Ben faked his own death by making it appear like he drowned in the cave, but had actually exited the water safely, leaving his old life behind. Ben fell victim to some sort of foul play either during or after his dive, and his body was hidden, either inside or outside of the cave. Part 2 will cover the approximate timeline of events surrounding Ben's last dive, an in-depth look at the cave and its dangers, and evidence, or lack thereof, found during the search. If you haven't yet read Part 1, check it out here. Part 1, Intro into the case, diving info, and background. Wednesday, August 18th. Ben arrived early at Versus and began his first of 3 dives for the hot, 90°F summer day. As seen later in CCTV footage, Ben made small talk with the employees in the dive shop before he set out on his dives. Ben completed 2 dives during the late morning and early afternoon. After resurfacing from the second dive, he was seen on security cameras returning to the dive shop to refill his tanks. Divers noticed that Ben spent the much of the afternoon sitting alongside the water testing equipment, making notes in his dive log, and possibly waiting for Versus to close. Versus closed around 5 to 6 p.m., though divers were allowed to dive later in the evening as long as they purchased the right kind of pass. Divers suspected that Ben was waiting for everyone to go home for the day so he could sneak past the gate. Around 6:30 p.m., Ben called his mother on his cell phone, which was the last contact he had with his family. He left a friend another voicemail, sounding exciting for his big third dive. The sun began to set around 7:30 p.m., as Ben got suited up. He swam through the basin and main cavern to the cave's entrance, making his way to the locked gate. On that dive, Ben was last seen near the gate by 2 divers, Eduardo Tran and Chuck Cronin, both Versus employees. The 2 were enjoying their weekly relaxing dive after Versus closed for the day. On their way out, they came upon Ben, who was tampering with the gate in order to break into the dangerous areas he was not certified to go. As the 2 friends swung out of the cave, Eduardo decided to go back and unlock the gate for Ben, feeling that was the safer option. He worried that without a dive buddy, being the last diver of the day, and possibly tampering with the locks, Ben would overexert himself, get stuck and drown. Overexertion could cause Ben to use up his air supply too quickly, wasting precious few minutes he would need if he had trouble on his dive. That trouble could include needing to cut through tangled line, getting his bearings straight if he got turned around or disoriented, dragged and freeing gear snagged on rocks, or having to wait for silt to settle if he accidentally kicked it up. By opening the gate for Ben, Eduardo guessed that he would have saved Ben about 5 or 6 minutes of air, which would help minimize the risks of overexertion. Ben likely experienced a rush of anxiety, or maybe even mild panic, when he realized he wasn't alone in the cave. Getting caught red-handed surely caused his heart to beat faster and his breathing rate to increase. Cave divers know anxiety or panic can have deadly consequences, so they train extensively by practicing drills to control their breathing. Even if Ben knew about controlling breathing, there is no replacement for running those drills under the guidance of an instructor. At depths below 30 meters, every breath counts, even more so than near the surface, making panic or anxiety potentially deadly. Eduardo and other divers suspected that Ben had been tampering with the gate prior to the 18th. Ben likely had planned his big dive specifically for later in the evening, after the other divers had left for the day. He could explore the cave without the risk of somebody catching him breaking in. Eduardo felt that even if he locked the gate back up, Ben would just force his way through regardless. If Ben was going to attempt to dive with many added risks, Eduardo might as well do what little he could. After opening the gate, Eduardo and Chuck left Ben to his dive. The two friends swam back to the surface, tended to their gear, and then headed out for coffee. Note: Eduardo is a commercial, technical diver, hired by Versus to vacuum out sand and silt from the cave so it stays passable, not to babysit or police the activities of Versus's guests. He was, however, friendly with many of the visiting divers, casually chatting with Ben and the others as they filled their tanks. He has stated that he frequently stayed late at Versus, often waiting to see the bubbles of the last diver for the day, meaning the diver was decompressing and would soon surface. On the 18th, however, Eduardo had plans to hang out with Chug, but he felt okay leaving before seeing Ben's bubbles, because the owner of Versus at the time, Lowell Kelly, was staying late that night. Thursday, August 19th. The next day, around 10 a.m., Eduardo noted Ben struck in the parking lot, but wasn't alarmed. It was going to be a hot 90°F that day, and Versus would soon be very busy with swimmers, campers, and hikers. Eduardo simply noted, "Ben's here," before continuing on with his daily duties. In the 4 months before he went missing, Ben entered over 250 dives in his dive logs. He had practically become a fixture at Versus, so it wasn't strange for Ben to be back the next day, or even the next day after that. Ben's truck was at Versus so often, it practically became a part of the scenery for the employees. It wouldn't be unusual for Ben's truck to be in the parking lot several days in a row. It took Ben about an hour to drive to Versus from his parents' beach home, so he often got there early. He would prepare for 2 or 3 long dives, so it wasn't uncommon for Ben to arrive before some of the employees, be at the resort all day, and leave after they all went home for the day. It cost $25 a day for scuba divers, so Ben made the most of his time. The beautifully clear blue water of Versus isn't immune to getting murky or experiencing reduced visibility. The water is usually its clearest at the beginning of the day, before guests enter the water and kick stuff up. Busy summer days meant the water would become less clear as divers entered and exited, or their flippers stirred up the bottom. There is a designated part of Versus specifically for swimmers, with the cave entrance being off-limits. The jumping, playing and splashing of swimmers can affect the visibility for the divers, so their spot for swimming is further downstream. Occasionally swimmers would get too close to the diver's entrance, causing some minor arguing between the two groups. Ben invested so much time at Versus, it makes sense that he might want to get there before all the kids started showing up and splashing around. Friday, August 20th. When Eduardo arrived to work at 10 a.m. Friday morning, he noticed Ben's big black truck again in the same spot, this time becoming alarmed. Worried, he asked around to the other employees if anyone had seen Ben on Thursday or earlier that morning. When it became clear that no one had seen the diver since Wednesday, Eduardo called the police to report Ben as overdue. While waiting for police to arrive, Eduardo was the first to get suited up and search for Ben. If a diver potentially drowned in the cave, with his experience and knowledge of the cave, Eduardo would voluntarily dive down and search. If he found Ben's body, He'd tie a line of rope to the spot to make it easier for recovery divers to find. Law enforcement, LA, arrived at the scene while Eduardo was diving in the cave. While the officers waited at the surface for him to return, another diver surfaced. The diver told LA that he dove down to the gate, which was left open, but that he did not see Ben. LA notified Ben's family back home in Memphis of his likely drowning. Ben's father Shelby, mother Patty, and girlfriend Emily Greer immediately hit the road for the 7-hour drive to Versus. LA then called local divers certified in cave diving and rescue, recovery to aid in locating and retrieving Ben's body. They began putting together rotating teams to start the search. An in-depth look at Vortex Spring and Cave. To really understand how difficult the search was for the recovery divers, let's go over what the inside of the deceivingly simple cave looks like and just how perilously tight it gets the deeper it goes. Just as a forewarning, some of the photos, drawings, and videos of the cave can make even the bravest feel anxious and/or claustrophobic. You can skip the visual aids and just read the descriptions if needed. The basin. From above, Versus kinda looks like a blue tadpole, a beautiful blue-green circle with a spring runoff flowing in Blue Creek to the northeast, and another teal-colored pool to the north. Visitors can swim, snorkel, paddle and kayak in the pool, runoff, and creek, but the main attraction is diving in the spring, cave. The freshwater spring remains a constant chilly 69 F all year long, and produces approximately 28 million gallons of water daily. Beneath the surface of the spring, a diver will find a bowl-shaped basin. The basin is about 250 feet wide, and open water. Certified divers can explore up to 50 feet deep. Its sloping rocky sides funnel down to a sandy, rocky bottom. The basin is a home to bluegills, catfish, carp, bass, and koi. Divers often bring cheese whiz and cans of little sausages to hand-feed the friendly fish. Skip to 215. The basin is a playground for divers, with small man-made caverns, crevices to peer into, large boulders and outcroppings, even some arches and tree trunks to swim around/under/through. There are 3 docks, staircases for divers entering the water, as well as 2 underwater platforms for training. About 28 feet below the surface is a talk box, which is an open bottom box that holds a pocket of air. Divers can stick their heads up inside to speak to each other. Skip to 4 o'clock. Usually divers use the talk box to communicate plans to their dive buddies before proceeding into the cave, for instructors to speak to students, and check for any signs of narcosis. That video also has a great little visual tour around the basin. Divers are asked to add a couple puffs of air from their tanks when they exit to help prevent carbon dioxide buildup. Versus does not provide fresh air to the talk box to discourage inexperienced divers and free divers, those who dive on only one big breath of air, from venturing inside, as it can be dangerous. The cavern, cave entrance, and gate. Knowing exactly what parts of Versus are open water, overhead, cavern, and cave diving can be a little tricky because there are so many different environments located in the spring. To help clear up any confusion, here's an infographic. Overhead, cavern is diving where there is anything overhead, anything above the diver besides open sky/water, but where the sun's rays still provide some light. The beginning of a cave is an overhead environment where the sunlight no longer penetrates. There is a buoyed line of nylon rope floating from the surface of the spring, leading down to the bottom of the basin, past a sign warning untrained divers to keep out at the entrance of the large cavern on the southwest side. The large cavern doesn't seem to have a specific name, so I'll refer to it as the main cavern. Swimming through to the back of the main cavern, Where natural light can no longer reach, is where a diver will find the cave's entrance, a tunnel leading into total darkness. A common misconception is that the underwater gate blocks the cave's entrance, but the mouth of the cave is actually located in the back of the main cavern, about 58 feet deep. A stop sign and a Grim Reaper sign again warns inexperienced divers to stay out. There's nothing in this cave worth dying for. Continuing past the signs, a diver would find one of the cave's larger rooms called the piano room. It was named so for the interesting sounds divers' exhaled breath creates inside the room. The piano room is sometimes lit by a string of rope lights. They can be seen some of the videos posted above. Here's a video of a diver passing the Grim Reaper warning sign, swimming through the small tunnel that leads to the piano room. Note, near the piano room, there was an unexplored, impassable tunnel that is now an open passage. When Ben went missing in 2010, the graded tunnel had not yet been dredged, explored, or surveyed, and it was full of silt. The grate over the opening was visible, but it did not have a locking door with a rentailable key. No signs of anyone tampering with the grate were found. A cursory search was done in the area, but there were no disturbances in the sediment, nor any other signs that a diver had been mucking around in there recently. The passage in verses continues deeper, flattening out a bit as a diver approaches the gate. The gate is about 115 feet below the surface, and it's made of welded rebar. The door is located in the middle, and opens from the left side. It's adorned with a few signs from previous divers, as well as a flag to indicate the water flow. Beyond the gate, the searching of the basin, caverns, piano room and area around the gate of the cave quickly came up empty, requiring the recovery divers to venture into the dangerously tight restrictions beyond the gate. The restriction spots where it is difficult to squeeze through require a diver to mount their tanks on their flanks, even requiring a diver to remove their tanks, push them through the opening first, then squeeze their body, though in some places. The tightest confines even require a diver to turn their head sideways to fit. The spring is natural, but the cave is not. The Dockery family, the original owners of Versus, had the spring excavated, opening up the cave for exploration. A pipe was installed to dredge out the sediment, keeping the water beautifully clear. The cave has a sandy bottom, with some clay silt in places, and can experience an occasional collapse. The cave has been excavated further, creating a new passage, but when Ben vanished, the cave only had the one passage. Most caves in Florida can be described like Swiss cheese, with many crevices, tunnels, nooks and crannies, multiple passages, and hidey holes worming all throughout the limestone. Versus, however, does not have those same features. It's more like a long tube, shaped like half-cylinder, with only one way in and one way out, and very few cracks and crevices that could hide a drowned diver. Here's a short, yet detailed view of what it's like to explore beyond the gate, into the first two restrictions. The first restriction is right after the gate, tightening to a hole just 4 to 5 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. A diver would drop down through that small hole, entering a small room. Above and to the right is a vertical fissure in the rock, and down to the left is a dead end called No Way. This video not only shows exploration of No Way, but it also shows how a diver could easily cause a silt out, when visibility drops to zero due to kicked up sediment. Just as a warning, that video can be a bit terrifying. Pushing past the fissure and No Way, comes the second restriction, called the back mount squeeze. It's a long, flat passage described as back to belly. This long restriction is just tall enough to accommodate a diver and their gear. A diver could try to squeeze through with back-mounted tanks, though most will use side-mounted tanks in order to fit better. In the second restriction, divers will use a specialized tool, that kinda looks like a dumbbell, to sink into the sand as a handle for dragging and pulling their body and gear through the low ceiling. Once out of that tiring second restriction, a diver would arrive at a space called the T-room. Looking up, a diver would see a nearly vertical opening into an area called the max headroom, a fun play on words, since the room allows the diver to get more upright and off their belly, with more room for their head. If the diver looks downward, they'll see the drop into the third restriction. The third restriction is called the champagne bottleneck, and for good reason. It's a long, skinny tube so small that divers are forced to remove their tanks and gear and push it through the opening first before squeezing down in after it. The spring flows outward, like the fizzy drink coming out of a bottle, so divers have to work against the current as they slide their bodies down the long tube. Because the opening is so small, the current can be more intense than in other parts of the cave. Before we make our descriptive way through the final fourth restriction, here's your final warning: if you suffer from anxiety, panic attacks, or claustrophobia, the videos linked in the next couple paragraphs may be too much for you. The passage doesn't get much bigger once past the third restriction. A diver would find another little pocket of room, around 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, to collect themselves and prepare for pushing the fourth restriction. The diver will have to shed any gear taller than 20 centimeters, bringing only their 8-inch wide tanks with them. Ahead they would see the rocky, cylindrical ceiling sloping down the sides into the sandy bottom. The 15 feet-ish long horizontal stretch requires the diver to crawl along on their belly again. This section of the cave is often compared to trying to crawl under a car or bed in full scuba gear. As the diver moves forward into the fourth, the height clearance drops to only 12 inches, shrinking to only about 3 feet wide. Beyond this point, the diver will not be able to turn around unless they can fit all the way through the fourth restriction. If they cannot fit through, or if they get stuck, they will have to navigate their way out of the fourth backwards, hoping they don't get snagged on the jagged rocks. Kicking up the silt and sand ever so slightly while wriggling through can cause the visibility to drop to 0 in seconds. The ceiling clearance then drops down to only 10 inches as the width of the passage shrinks to 2.5 feet wide. Carefully creeping forward, the passage tightens to its smallest, only 2 feet wide and 8 inches tall. To help picture that, stretch your fingers as wide as they go. The distance from your pinky fingertip across your hand to the thumb tip is about 8 inches. The average human head is wider than 8 inches, so a diver would have to carefully turn their head sideways as they slowly pull through. Here's a video of a diver named Barry Allen, penetrating the fourth restriction in 2013. If you'd like to see from a diver's point of view what's squeezing through that tiny domed passage, and turning back around, is like, here's a video of Barry's dive buddy, Doug Kane, going in first. If the video is too much for you, here's a poorly drawn approximation of what the fourth is like. I'm not much of an artist, but it should give you a general idea. If a diver were to have found Ben's body in or beyond the fourth restriction, the recovery diver would have to carry the body of a 6 feet 1 inch 210 to 220 pounds man, with all of Ben's 200 plus pounds of gear, keeping connected to guide line, along with pulling all their own gear out of the cave at the same time, all while 170 feet deep, in cold water, squeezing their body along with Ben's back through every restriction, in possible zero visibility situations, trying not to get their gear or Ben's body, gear snagged or tangled up, all while going backwards. It's so tight and dangerous that the few divers who've made it all the way past the fourth can be counted using your fingers. And still have some left over. If that whole journey felt exhausting to read through, Remember that the divers would then have to make their way all the way back out, squeezing through all the restrictions from the other way. Once through that tiny choke point, another small room opens up. It's been dubbed the trash room, and it's just big enough to fit two divers turning around for their journey back out. I think it's called the trash room because the first divers to explore it left some gear behind. The trash room is about 20 feet or so long, 4-ish feet wide, and about 5 feet tall. Beyond the trash room is what some people call the fifth restriction, but it's actually the end of the line. It's a fissure, a tiny vertical crack that cannot be explored further. A smaller diver could try with extreme difficulty to squeeze into the crack a little ways, but only if the diver was planning to never come back out. The crack doesn't open up to another room, and it would be physically impossible to turn around even if some contortionist diver somehow squeezed a little ways into the 6-inch wide fissure. The few divers who managed to get that far into the cave have even struggled to get just an underwater camera to fit into the crack. Here's that map again, this time with some alterations to show what the end of the line looks like. The search begins. Now that you have a good understanding of the cave, let's move on to what the recovery divers did, and did not find while looking for the lost diver. The lead investigator for Holmes County, Captain Harry Hamilton, was assigned to Ben's case. Because of the technical aspects of searching the cave, Captain Hamilton decided their police divers didn't have the right kind of training. The investigator thought tons of divers, amateur and professional alike, would all be jumping to volunteer, but he was mistaken. The diving experience required to search any underwater cave, let alone one as dangerous as Versus, is extensive. They would have to be certified in full cave diving below 30 meters, using special gas mixes, along with other technical diving and recovery certification. He realized there just aren't that many people in the world who can have all that training and experience. Captain Hamilton contacted a diver by the name of Jeff Laughlin, asking for help in finding qualified cave recovery divers for the search. Jeff sent messages to different dive shops nearby, and was able to find 8 more experienced recovery divers. Jeff became the lead diver, and created 3 rotating teams with 3, 4, and 2 divers to a team. Team 1 made the first push in the cave looking for Ben, Team 2 replaced Team 1 to push further. Team 3 set up the extra tanks the other teams needed, as well as checking all the shallower areas of the cave and basin. The first physical evidence found were 3 stage tanks. Stage tanks are extra tanks cave divers bring along on long, deep, complicated dives to ensure they have enough air for the dive and for any potential emergencies that could arise. The 3 mismatching stage tanks had Ben's name written on them, but their locations and condition were bizarre. We will be going into detail about the stage tanks in Part 3. As each team surfaced, the next team went down, however, all came back up empty-handed. Ben's anxious family either paced along the water's edge, or they sat the picnic tables in complete physical and emotional exhaustion, waiting for their son's body to be retrieved. No one knew exactly where in the cave Ben might be, but the best guess was that he was inside the dangerous skated area. The divers meticulously shined their lights in every crack and crevice to no avail. The family's hope of retrieving Ben's remains started fading, and started shifting towards a hope of just finding their son's body, calling Ed Sorensen. When no evidence of Ben was found, some divers recommended that Holmes County should get in communication with Ed Sorensen, one of the most experienced cave recovery divers in the world. He was out of the country on vacation when the call came in, but ended his trip early to go help with the search. Sorensen knew that the cave was dangerous, as two of the previous rescue divers told him they nearly died searching for Ben, but Ed decided to try anyways for the grieving family. Despite most of his volunteer work being recoveries of drowned divers, he has saved lives too. Here's a little side story to emphasize Sorensen's credibility and skill. In the cave near his dive shop, a father with two grown children decided to explore the underwater cave, without certification, due to overconfidence. The father was a now dive instructor. The family kicked up so much silt that the visibility dropped to zero. Only the father and son found their way back to the surface. Another diver quickly called Sorensen, who took just 10 minutes to get his gear on and get in the water. Using his incredible skill, training, and experience, he followed his lines to make his way blindly through the cave. He discovered the daughter just barely keeping her face above the water in a small and underground pocket of trapped air. She'd blown through most of her air, and she was exhausted from trying to keep her mouth above the water to breathe from the little air pocket. She had tried several times to swim out of the cave, but she could not find her way with the silt kicked up. Trained cave divers learn a special technique called a frog kick to prevent kicking up clouds of silt and sand. She was mere minutes from drowning when Sorensen found her, got her breathing from his tanks with a rescue regulator, and lead her out of the cave while there was still zero visibility. Amazingly, he was able to bring the daughter back to her family, alive, a feat to prove his bravery and willingness to help, even if it meant possibly endangering himself. In verses, Sorensen used an underwater scooter, a handheld device to quickly swim to the back of the cave, giving him more time to search the cave. He had to bring his smaller tanks so he could squeeze and pull through the 8-inch squeeze of the fourth restriction. He went all the way to the end of the line fissure, looking into the cracks, which is the very furthest a diver could possibly go. At the time, the trash room and the end of the line fissure weren't even on the map. Sorensen, the third person to ever explore that far, the first two being the divers who first surveyed and mapped the cave. Sorensen found no marks in the silt or scratches on the cave ceiling in the deepest parts of the cave. He didn't find any evidence that would indicate a diver had ventured into the area since it was first surveyed. Sorensen had to remove his tanks and push them into the fourth restriction, then turn his head sideways in order to drag himself into the tight squeeze. He said that there was no way Ben could even have gone into the deepest restrictions. Sorensen has said, "I am 6 foot and 190 pounds, with smaller tanks, and I know what I'm doing, and I barely made it through. The last place I searched was pristine, without a mark that a diver had been there. It would be impossible to go through that restriction without making a mark on the floor or ceiling. He's not in there." For reference, Ben McDaniel was 6 feet 1 inch and 210 to 220 pounds. Another quote from Sorensen, clarification in parenthesis. "They asked me what I thought. I don't think he's in there. I went on 6-hour dives in a 1-hour cave, meaning the cave at Versus is small and can be explored in 1 hour, and checked all the nooks and crannies. There's no sign in the back of the cave, where he was supposed to be working, or that he was ever there. In the back of the cave, the roof is covered by an orangey-brown bacterial growth, and if you even brush against it slightly, you'll knock that off and you'll have stark white limestone showing. I didn't find that." Sorensen and other divers have said if someone tried to weasel through the fissure at the end of the line, they were guaranteed to never get back out. It's been suggested that Ben might have experienced diver panic. When a diver knows they are low on air and or hopelessly lost, they can flail, kick, and thrash about when they know they are about to drown. When diver panic happens, the diver can often wedge their body in tight crevasses and cracks, places you wouldn't expect a drowned diver to fit. Perhaps Ben could have squished his larger frame in a weird spot due to panicking? It sounds like that could very well be a good possibility, but in the actual cave, it just isn't. Any squeeze less than 10 inches would be impossible for Ben to get through, simply because of the size of the helmet he wore. Panicking divers may get themselves squeezed into strange nooks while fighting for air, thanks to human bodies being more or less squishy, but gear cannot. None of Ben's gear was found in any of the restrictions, nor near the fissure. The recovery divers did not find any scrape marks from Ben's equipment that would indicate he was exploring, let alone panicking. Ben's family was convinced he was in the cave, just farther and deeper than anyone else was willing to go. There was some miscommunication in earlier parts of the search. The first wave of divers scuffed up the cave walls in the first 2 restrictions, which the next team noticed. When the report of scuff marks came up, Ben's parents thought the report was a positive sign Ben was in the cave, and held on to that little glimmer of hope of finding his body. When Sorensen made the deepest dives out of all the divers before him, Ben's parents were upset to hear Sorensen say otherwise. They have vocalized their opinion that Sorensen was incorrect in his conclusion. Other search methods. The recovery divers began dropping out of the search when Sorensen declared that he did not believe Ben was in the cave. The dive team leader, Jeff Locken, said, "Everywhere I knew to look, I looked and didn't find him." One of the more vocal recovery divers, Kevin Carlisle, said, "We may never know the truth of where he is, but we do know where he isn't, and that is because of a lot of talented and qualified divers." Frustrated that the divers were no longer searching, Ben's parents inquired with Holmes County about the use of their ROV, remotely operated vehicle. La was concerned about losing the ROV to the cave, so they only agreed to let the McDaniels use it if they were willing to pay the $54,000 to replace it if got lost or damaged. Ben's parents agreed, saying they'd pay anything to find their son. The ROV had to be brought down into the cave by divers. Here's the video of Nick Vayton, one of the recovery divers delivering the ROV to the cave. Unfortunately, the ROV did not get any better results than the divers. It made it only 700 feet into the cave before the cables attached to it got too heavy, prohibiting the ROV from moving any further. It provided no new info about Ben's location. Even if the ROV could have traveled farther into the cave, it wouldn't have fit in the tight restrictions regardless. Shelby, Ben's father, explored other devices that might be able to continue to search for Ben. He's spoken of someone who makes drones for schools of tuna fish, but the device was way too big for the cave. A newer possibility is using drones. Drone technology has come a long way in the past few years, though I'm not sure if there are any underwater devices that could be piloted through rock. There has been interesting suggestions about also using technology to detect the metal of tanks. So far, these ideas have not yet been explored. Ben's parents then sought the man who originally surveyed the cave back in 2003, Steve Keene. Keene was the first to explore the restrictions all the way back to the end of the line fissure. Keene made 7 dives into those deepest reaches of the cave, but like Sorensen, he did not find anything that indicated Ben was in the cave. With every idea going bust, Ben's parents put out a $10,000 reward for anyone brave enough to find Ben. This greatly offended the diving community, who begged the grieving parents to rescind. When no one took them off on their offer, the McDaniels increased the reward to $30,000, enraging much of the diving community. After an inexperienced, uncertified diver drowned in a part of the cave he was not qualified to be in, possibly looking to claim the reward, Ben's parents were contacted by Jill Nerth. Jill is considered one of the very best female cave divers in the world, and is known for her underwater documentaries. She hoped that offering to film the entire dive, all the way to the back, proving Ben was not in the cave, Ben's parents would agree to rescind the reward. Jill's diving buddy and cameraman, her ex-husband Paul Nerth, found a fold-up shovel in the back of the cave, believed to be Ben's. They were hopeful at first knowing their son had the same shovel, but the shovel turned out to be Steve Keen's, all the way back from when he first mapped the cave. It coincidentally was found in the trash room. The shovel, mentioned in the ID episode of Disappeared about Ben's case, proved to be a red herring. Other evidence: Ben is not in the cave. Besides finding the 3 suspicious stage tanks with Ben's name on them, the recovery divers noticed what they weren't finding: any evidence that Ben had ever explored the tide restrictions. With Sorensen declaring that he was 99.99% sure that Ben was not in there, some of the recovery divers started searching for indirect signs that Ben's body was in the cave. Decomposition. Divers searched for any signs of Ben's body decomposing. Though chilly, 69°F is warm enough for decomposition to occur. A body would go through the process of rigor around 12 hours after death, then would go limp, wrinkle, turn a blotchy green, black, bloat, float, and get scavenged by animals, with the leftover remains the gear returning back to the cave's floor. The cold, deep, dark freshwater, plus Ben's wetsuit, other gear, would have slowed decomposition a little bit. But, even in chilly water, there should have been very apparent signs of decomposition in the cave. The freshwater spring is home to wildlife including carp, bluegills, bass, koi, and eels. The eels who inhabit the dark cave are carnivorous, but not dangerous to humans. The eels can be friendly, particularly when divers bring little cans of Vienna sausages for them. The recovery divers found 0 signs of any wildlife scavenging. Recovery divers explain that the release of gases and fluids during decomposition are noticeable through their regulators, mouthpieces, describing it as an unpleasant odor or taste. None of the divers detected that odor, taste. Over 30 tests on the water were done by a lab, throughout the 36 days of the search. The tests looked for bacteria produced from decomposition, but all of the tests came back negative. Thanks for reading, and I hope you enjoyed this rather long installment. This one is by far the longest of the bunch. I have good news: I've finally pestered the original creator of a Reddit sub for Ben enough to allow me to take over. I have 0 clue how to mod, but I'll be putting these write-ups over there once it's finished here. If anyone has any advice or can help in getting that sub off the ground, please feel free to PM me. In the next installment, Part 3 will cover the search for Ben above the water, info about Ben's training, gear and how it doesn't quite pass the sniff test, as well as looking more closely into those suspicious stage tanks. That is all for now. I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you for listening and please subscribe. Till next time.